Let's listen in to President Obama speaking after his meeting with Cuban President Raúl Castro.
Pueblo de la ciudad de Panamá
y a
todos los panameños por haber sido anfitriones excelentes durante la Cumbre de las Américas, debido a su ubicación estratégica, un lugar en las que culturas y el comercio en nuestro hemisferio se han cruzado. Panamá se llama la cruce de la vida, y con el liderazgo de Panamá nuestros países se han unido para enfocar al mundo, el futuro y lo que podemos construir para
This has been my third Summit of the Americas and my 8th visit to Latin America. And my trip reflects, as I mentioned earlier, a new era of U.S. engagement in the region. Over the past few days, we've advanced our engagement across the board. In keeping with the Inter-American Democratic Charter, we continue to stand up strongly for democracy and human rights. This was the first summit of the Americas to include a formal role for civil society. As I said at yesterday's forum, the United States will continue to deepen our support for civil society groups across the Americas and around the world. I'm pleased that there was widespread agreement among the nations here that civil society groups have a permanent role in future summits. And the United States will support this work through the new Innovation Center we're creating to empower civil society groups across Latin America. How to promote greater opportunity for the Cuban people was also a major focus of my meeting with President Castro, the first between leaders of our two nations in more than half a century. I told President Castro in private what I've said in public, that our governments will continue to have our differences, and the United States will continue to stand firmly for universal values and human rights. At the same time, we agreed that we can continue to take steps forward that advance our mutual interests. We'll continue to work toward reestablishing diplomatic relations, reopening embassies in Havana and Washington, and encouraging greater contacts and commerce and exchanges between our citizens. I'm optimistic that we'll continue to make progress and that this can indeed be a turning point, not just between the United States and Cuba, but for greater cooperation among countries across the region. Second, we continued our work to create more prosperity and opportunity for our people. At our meeting yesterday, Central American leaders reaffirmed their commitment to pursue the good governance and economic and security reforms that are needed. And I reiterated my commitment to work with Congress to secure the $1 billion I've proposed for our engagement with Central America. Yesterday's deal between Boeing and Copa Airlines will support jobs in the United States, in Panama, and across the region, and I think is representative of the commercial opportunities that allow both North and Southern hemispheres, both North and South America, as well as Central America, to prosper if we deepen those trade ties. I was encouraged by the support of many leaders here for the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, which would boost regional trade, and for the Trans-Pacific Partnership with its high standards for trade and strong protections for workers and the environment. Thanks to Panama's leadership, this summit included a special focus on how countries can expand access to education. I want to thank our private sector partners who pledged to continue their support of our 100,000 Strong in the Americas initiative to encourage more exchanges between our students, the nearly $70 million in investments that I've announced in Jamaica will expand education and training and employment programs for young people across Latin America and the Caribbean, including the impoverished and marginalized communities. And the Young Leaders of the Americas initiative that I launched will help young entrepreneurs and civil society leaders across the entire region access the training and the resources and connections they need to start new ventures, including the small businesses that create so many jobs in the region. Finally, we took new steps to invest in clean energy and combat climate change. The new fund I announced with our Caribbean and Central American partners will help mobilize private sector investment in clean energy projects and reduce carbon emissions across the region. And our new Energy Task Force will identify additional steps we can take together. A number of our countries committed to doubling our collective share of non-hydro renewable energy by 2030. I reaffirmed that through our $3 billion pledge to the Green Climate Fund, the United States will continue to help developing nations deal with the impacts of climate change. And I reiterated our commitment to ensure that all countries in the hemisphere have open access to climate data as we meet this challenge together. So, continued progress on Cuba, new commitments to help lift up young people in the region, new partnerships to protect this beautiful land and our planet. As I said this morning, the United States is more deeply engaged across the region than we have been in decades, and I believe the relationship between the United States and the Americas is as good as it has ever been. We're focused on the future and what we can build and achieve together. And our engagement with the countries and peoples of the Americas is going to continue throughout the remainder of my presidency. So with that, let me take some questions. I'll start with Jim Cunin.
Thank you, Mr. President. Sir, you head back to the United States with the task of convincing the American people in Congress on two major foreign policy initiatives, the framework for a nuclear deal with Iran, and likely soon a decision to remove Cuba from a list of state sponsors of terror. Recently, remarks by Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei have raised doubts among some as to whether that deal can occur in Iran. And Senator Schumer, an ally of yours, has wants Congress to have the right to vote on removal of sanctions. Presidential politics are likely to play a part in this Cuba decision, inevitably. So I'm wondering if it would take a lot of political capital just to get one done, let alone two. Have you bitten off more than you can chew?
No. You may be surprised by that response, Jim. Let me take them in turn. First of all, with respect to Cuba, there is majority support of our policy in the United States, and there's overwhelming support for our policy in Cuba. I think people recognize that if you keep on doing something for 50 years and it doesn't work, you should try something new. And so the American people don't need to be persuaded that this is, in fact, the right thing to do. I recognize that there's still concerns and questions that Congress may have. We've got concerns and questions about specific activities that are taking place in Cuba and human rights and reform. There were two members of the Cuban civil society that were in attendance at the meeting that I had yesterday who expressed much of what they have to go through on a day-to-day basis. They were supportive of our policy of engagement with Cuba. I don't think that it's so much we have to persuade anybody. The issue of the state sponsor of terrorism list, as you know, the State Department has provided a recommendation. It's gone through our interagency process. I'll be honest with you, I have been on the road, and I want to make sure that I have a chance to read it, study it, before we announce publicly what the policy outcome is going to be. But in terms of the overall direction of Cuba policy, I think there is a strong majority, both in the United States and in Cuba, that says our ability to engage, to open up commerce and travel and people-to-people exchanges is ultimately going to be good for the Cuban people. Now, with respect to Iran, I have always been clear, we are not done yet. What we were able to obtain was a political framework between the P5+1 nations and Iran that provided unprecedented verification of what is taking place in Iran over the next 2 decades, that significantly cuts back on its centrifuges, that cuts off pathways for it to obtain a nuclear weapon, and that calls for, in return, the rolling back of sanctions in a phased way that allows us to snap back if Iran violates the agreement. That's the political framework. That was not just something that the United States and Iran agreed to, but Iran agreed to a political framework with the other P5+1 nations. Now, what's always been clear is that Iran has its own politics around this issue. They have their own hardliners. They have their own countervailing impulses in terms of whether or not to go forward with something, just as we have in our country. And so it's not surprising to me that the Supreme Leader or a whole bunch of other people are going to try to characterize the deal in a way that protects their political position. But I know what was discussed in arriving at the political agreement. What I've always said, though, is that there's the possibility of backsliding. There's the possibility that it doesn't get memorialized in a way that satisfies us, that we're able to verify that, in fact, Iran is not getting a nuclear weapon, and that we are preserving the capacity to snap back sanctions in the event that they are breaking any deal. And that's why the work is going to be so important between now and the end of June to memorialize this so that we can all examine it. And we don't have to speculate on what the meaning of a deal is going to be. Either there's going to be a document that Iran agrees with the world community about and a series of actions that have to be taken, or there's not. Part of the challenge in this whole process has been opponents of basically any deal with Iran have constantly tried to characterize what the deal is without seeing it. Now, if we are able to obtain a final deal that comports with the political agreement, and I say if because that's not yet final, then I'm absolutely positive that that is the best way to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And that's not my opinion. That's the opinion of people like Ernie Moniz, my Secretary of Energy, who is a physicist from MIT and actually knows something about this stuff. That's the opinion of a whole bunch of nuclear experts who examined the deal. Very rarely do you see a consensus. Consensus is too strong a word. A large majority of people who are experts in the field saying this is actually a realistic, plausible, meaningful approach to cut off the pathways for Iran getting a nuclear weapon, and that it is more likely to succeed, not only than maintaining current sanctions or additional sanctions, but more likely to succeed than if we took a military approach to solving the problem. Again, that's not uniquely my opinion. That is, talk to people who are not affiliated with the administration, some of whom were skeptical about our capacity to get a deal done, and have now looked at it and said, if we're able to actually get what was discussed in the political framework, it's absolutely the right thing to do. Now, there's politics and political pressure inside of the United States. We all know that. The Prime Minister of Israel is deeply opposed to it. I think he's made that very clear. I have repeatedly asked, what is the alternative that you present that you think makes it less likely for Iran to get a nuclear weapon? And I have yet to obtain a good answer on that. And the narrow question that's going to be presented next week when Congress comes back is what's Congress's appropriate role in looking at a final deal? And I've talked to not only Bob Corker, but I've talked to Ben Cardin, the ranking member on the Democratic side, and I want to work with them so that Congress can look at this deal when it's done. What I'm concerned about is making sure that we don't prejudge it, or those who are opposed to any deal whatsoever try to use a procedural argument essentially to screw up the possibility of a deal. Last comment I'm going to make on this. When I hear some, like Senator McCain recently, suggest that our Secretary of State, John Kerry, who served in the United States Senate, a Vietnam veteran, who's provided exemplary service to this nation, is somehow less trustworthy in the interpretation of what's in a political agreement than the supreme leader of Iran, that's an indication of the degree to which partisanship has crossed all boundaries. And we're seeing this again and again. We saw it with the letter by the 47 senators who communicate directly to the supreme leader of Iran, the person that they say can't be trusted at all, warning him not to trust the United States government. We have Mitch McConnell trying to tell the world, don't have confidence in the U.S. government's abilities to fulfill any climate change pledge that we might make. And now we have a senator